Right, so in this video we're going to actually run the multiple regression and interpret the outcomes. So in the previous videos we've tested all the assumptions. So if you haven't done that for your own regression, then you need to go back and watch those videos to make sure that the assumptions of linear relationship, multicollinearity, homoscedasticity, and what's the last one? Normality of the residuals have all met those assumptions. So you've tested them and those assumptions are not violated. Okay, so we have our data, we have our dependent variable Mac sum, the sum of the Machiavelli score, and then we have some levels of personality types. So extroversion, high scores represent extroversion, low scores represent introversion. Agreeableness, high scores represent greater levels of agreeableness, lower scores represent less agreeableness. Conscientiousness, emotion, and openness to new experiences. So we're going to be looking at whether these variables, these aspects of personality, are predictors of Machiavellian tendencies or beliefs. Right, so we're going to simply go to Analyze, Regression, and Linear Regression. I've already added them in here, but you can add them back. So we have our dependent variable, and the dependent variable, this is what you are kind of predicting. So what predicts this variable? That's why we call everything else predictors. And then I simply want to, let's have a look here. So if you're doing hierarchical regression, you would look at R-squared changed, but otherwise it's not really that important. Okay, so let's have a look at this model. So firstly, let's have a look at model summary, right? The important bit here is the adjusted R-squared. So adjusted R-squared is an indicator of how much variance is explained of your outcome by your predictors. So that is essentially a proportion which can be converted to a percentage, i.e. the variables of extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness explain 19.1% of the variance of Machiavellianism as we scored it. Okay, so why do we use adjusted R-squared? Because essentially R-squared doesn't account for just the variance of including additional variables. So you can report both, but really adjusted R-squared is the more robust measure to use and to interpret the variance explained by your model. So next is this little Anova. So really what this is doing is looking at if your model is a good fit for your data. So how you would report this is essentially reporting the degrees of freedom for your predictors, because you have 5 predictors, n-1, so your participants, probably 263 participants, -1 -5, and that should give you 257. So f5, 257 equals 13.370, p less than p001. So because it's less than 0.05, our alpha, the standard default alpha. So essentially what a significant ANOVA means is that our variables of personality types that we've include this can be used to reliably predict Machiavellian tendencies in participants as measured by the scale that we used. Okay, that's essentially what it's saying. So now let's go to the coefficients. Okay, so here we see our coefficients, and really that's really the main point of interest in our regression model. So we can see the unstandardized coefficients and their errors, the kind of residuals, how far away they are from actually being predicted by the model. And then we had the standardized coefficients, the t-value, which is the kind of critical value you look at, and the size of the t represents the level of the p, so the significance. And then VIF, we went over that in a previous video. So generally, the difference between unstandardized and standardized coefficients is that you may have predictors that are measured on different scales. And therefore, because they're on different scales, you can't really compare a kind of unstandardized coefficients because they are in their natural units. So one scale might go from 1 to 5 and one go from 1 to 10. So therefore a 2 on a 5 scale as a coefficient is not the same as a 2 on a 10 scale as a coefficient. So in that case you would use the standardized coefficients because that kind of standardizes them, so mean of 0, standard deviation of 1, and allows you to kind of compare the magnitude of the effect or the magnitude of the size of the coefficient amongst different scale variables. However, all of our predictors are on the same scale, so the size of the unstandardized effect would be kind of corresponding to the size of the standardized coefficient in terms of interpretability. So how do we interpret these in terms of their predictive capabilities? So for every 1 point change in agreeableness, for instance, Machiavellianism will be decreased by 4.5 points. Likewise, 1 point change in conscientiousness would, or 1 point increase in conscientiousness would lead to a reduction of 1.237 on the Machiavellian scale. So that's how these unstandardized coefficients can be interpreted in relation to the outcome variable, Machiavellianism. So how do you interpret these? Well, the difference between a regression and a correlation is that you interpret a single coefficient in a regression analysis while holding the other variables constant, right? Because if we did not include all of these other variables in the model, the exact coefficients would be different. So that's how we have to interpret it. So for instance, we can see that agreeableness is a statistically significant value, right? However, we would report it by saying holding extroversion, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to new experiences constant, agreeableness is a significant negative predictor of Machiavellianism. So similarly here we can see that conscientiousness is also a negative predictor. So that means as agreeableness and conscientiousness increase, Machiavellian tendencies decrease. However, emotional stability, interestingly, is a positive predictor while holding the others constant. So that means as emotional stability increases, so too does one's Machiavellian tendencies. You can see that because our extroversion has a significance level or a p-value of 0.88, extroversion and likewise introversion are not significant predictors of Machiavellianism. Similarly, for openness to new experiences, not a significant predictor while holding all of the other variables constant. So that is essentially how you would interpret a regression analysis. How you would write it up, essentially, I would use the APA format. You can never just copy and paste a SPSS output. You actually have to make your own tables. So this is an example of what this table might look like if you're doing some report or something. So you have your variables here, your predictors here. Of course, you title it, and then you refer to it in text. So you kind of talk about what these results actually mean. Don't just kind of throw it there. So extroversion, not a significant predictor. So you have your unstandardized coefficient, and unstandardized error, and then your standardized beta score, and then your t-values and your p-values, and yeah, that is pretty much it for the regression. Then you go on to subsequently talk about it and discuss it. And that is all for this video. I hope it was helpful. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.